want your vote. Now let me start by thanking you. You and your families are extraordinary. It truly takes my breath away just thinking about the service that you have given to our nation. You left the security of your homes and the solace of your families so that I could walk here out of danger. Thank you. I'm honored today to share your story because your story is my story. In 1963, my father, an Air Force pilot, was killed on active duty. My mom, as a young widow, was left to raise two, I was good, rambunctious kids. And as many of you know, I am married to the love of my life, John Jones, a retired Navy commander. This afternoon's discussion is about one of the great passions of my life, our U.S. military, their families, and the critical advocacy I will take up on your behalf in Congress. As a Navy wife, I certainly know what it is like to be alone for months at a time while my husband was at sea, and the much tougher adjustments when he came home. I know what it was like to wait in line at a military hospital and to wait for treatment at a VA center. I know what it was like to need medical care and to have to drive a very long way. And I withstood, like you, the good and the bad parts of the 60-mile rule. The issues before our warriors today have major implications for our military community and literally every part of our life in America. What concerns me is that Congress has had all ding-dang year to work on your issues without success. We should expect our elected legislators to come up with reasonable solutions and necessary compromises in reasonable timeframes. Waiting and dallying while your urgent needs remain unmet is not acceptable. We must get on top of this. So here's some things we need to do. We need to assure that the benefits that you earned with your service, your sacrifice, with your blood, and often the life of your friends is secure. We need to address the funding for lifelong care issues from PTSD to traumatic brain injury, cancer, prosthetics, wound care. Y'all know the list. We need to make sure that families have the mental health and counseling needs met when warriors are deployed and when they return home. And jobs. Jobs, jobs, and education to combat poverty, homelessness, alcoholism, and suicide. In Washington, I will be your advocate. I know firsthand the issues we who choose a military life face. I know the legislative process, how to get things done, how to make alliances, and how to protect the most precious to all of us, those who defend our nation. When you volunteered and raised your hand and wrote a blank check to our nation, including the willingness to sacrifice your life, you did so based on a promise by this country. It is time for America to live up to that promise.
Yes, here we go.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the American Legion Post 22 for hosting this debate. And I'd also like to thank the veterans and their families and the community for participating. It means a lot to the candidates to have you tonight in attendance. Now, like many New Mexicans, my roots run deep in these communities. And like most New Mexicans, I'm very proud of my heritage because it defines who we are. Now, this heritage has produced hardworking, family-oriented, proud people for 400 years of successes and struggles. And protecting this legacy requires courage, conviction, and integrity. Now, I've spent my entire career fighting for seniors and veterans and their families, and I'm ready to take that fight to Washington, D.C. to Mexicans are worried about keeping their jobs or even having one. And too many others are going without health care. And our children, quite simply, don't have the same educational opportunities that we once had. Our veterans are returning home from the battlefields, scarred from their injuries and invisible wounds, and today, they are often left to fend for themselves. We must do better. Now, I'm running for Congress to take responsibility for putting veterans and their families first and more. My grandfather and father both proudly served in the Air Force. My grandfather retired from the Air Force, and my father returned home after his service as a civilian to practice dentistry. And I believe that he was one of the very first dentists in New Mexico to serve in public health, or to continue that tradition of public service. Both my grandfather and father raised families that understood the value of community participation in public service. They, in fact, raised patriotic families. And my father didn't have an immediate relationship with the Veterans Administration. It came later. In fact, it came when my family needed it most. At his funeral, he received full military honors. And the respect and tribute paid to my father for his service was the very thing that meant so much to my family, that he wasn't forgotten, he was remembered. And we proudly laid him to rest at the National Cemetery along with my sister. Today, veterans are struggling to find that relationship with the veteran service. And in fact, today, the challenges that they are facing, they're unemployed, they're homeless, they have significant mental health issues, they have claims that are backlogged for months or even years, and they have traumatic injuries that we are not equipped to deal with. Now, we have to do better. Congress should be putting veterans and their families first. As your Congresswoman, I won't forget. We weren't forgotten. I won't forget. I will put veterans and their families first. And I ask you that together, let's take our shared New Mexico values and my record of getting things done to Washington, D.C. And I believe that we can make a difference for New Mexico veterans and their families. Thank you so very much.
First question, and the first response will be from Janice. Protecting service members who are serving overseas, and in particular in the war zone, their right to vote. It presents a unique challenge to the states. What do you feel that you coming to Washington can do to assure that every service member serving overseas, and particularly in a combat zone, will be able to exercise their right to vote?
I am so grateful that it is 2012, because in 1975, when John went to sea, there was no email. Many of you remember the Mars calls. Hello, honey. He says he loves you. Those days are gone. Thank goodness. And so in answer to the question, a number of things have happened that are already securing an active duty member's right to vote. It comes under HAVA. There are segments for the military in particular. And so here are the things as it stands right this minute. Military members can request an absentee ballot. We have to mail them out. Every Secretary of State must mail them out in time for them to be returned. But there is now a safeguard. And in our state, I was privileged to work very hard on this, because there are times the mail doesn't work. When you're in a combat theater, you don't know if the mail can get through those hard copy ballots. Is it better to make sure that the active duty service member can vote by fax or by email? I'm glad to tell you that both of those options are available today. I worry that some of the technology we are using at this moment does not preserve the right to privacy when you vote. That is a risk. But I know with the technology that is available that we can actually allow our active duty members to vote closer to real time and to do so electronically with integrity. But at the very end of the day, we must commit that all of our processes will make sure those ballots reach our active duty members and that the ballots are returned. And I do want to just say one other thing. This is really kind of election law. If your ballot is mailed and you happen to be overseas, the active duty military ballots can be counted all the way up to the canvas, which is sort of a hidden piece of the law. But I want you to know that your election law is truly designed to protect the active duty members' right to vote.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. We have an obligation in this country to protect every person's vote, but absolutely not to forget those folks who are serving their country and are not in their communities to cast that ballot. And as you've heard, there have been many investments, but they haven't quite taken hold in a way that's meaningful enough. So for example, you've heard that the mail is too slow, that we aren't actively engaging in providing absentee ballots by a matter of course. So it ought to be pro forma for everybody who's serving. And I do think that we have limited our resources to not actively engage in internet voting. Internet voting has become a very interesting debate in this country, largely because of voter fraud and security issues. When we're dealing with military personnel, I don't think that those issues are nearly as paramount. We can do a much better job. And I think actually in CD1, I will tell you, and I'm sure the clerk here in Torrance County, but the clerk in Bernalillo County is very, very engaged in making sure that they are communicating. And that will be the next step. We need to make sure that our clerks have resources to be communicating with military personnel so that they're getting those votes as quickly as they can, know when they're coming. They ought to be immediately available. And we got to have clerks who, as Janice identified, who know the law sufficiently enough so that they're being counted after Election Day because they're in transit all the way through until those votes are certified. I do think that we've made great progress. I think the issue really is that now that we're trying to make sure that everyone, regardless of the combat zone, it is difficult to secure those votes and get them there. I think that what we really need to do is to make sure that the resources that are identified for voter protection are secure and available to military personnel and their families.
Thank you. And we'll lead off with this next question as well. What is your take in politicizing an act of war for political gain? This was given to us from a member of the VFW. Some have called it spiking the football when our troops are actually overseas still fighting.
I appreciate that question. I think today we are all disillusioned and frustrated by the lack of cooperation and focus by this Congress in particular on the people who really matter. And we're fighting about national security and we're fighting about economic security, which is a national security issue. We do that sometimes in a vacuum and we forget about the men and women who are serving. And I'll give you an example of that, how I've seen firsthand in our community the negative impact that that can have. So as we're debating the budget, we're debating in partisan context our occupations in the Middle East. There's men and women who are negatively impacted. And there's a family in the South Valley in Albuquerque who have worked on legislation. It's the Burn Pit Registry. Because while we're fighting about whether we should or we shouldn't, whether the budget should or shouldn't be, and whether or not we're going to pass the Veterans Jobs Bill or any other meaningful piece of legislation, putting all of those issues of the men and women who are serving this country at risk while we have those debates, we fail to look at the safety of those men and women who are putting their lives on the lines. Now, burn pits are an issue because we are burning all of our waste in the Middle East, and we are burning toxins. And as a result, those folks who are exposed now have carcinogens and related healthcare risks. And so we just now are passing legislation to prevent the burn pits. We should have been, every single time we had an opportunity, looking at what our national security issues are, what our funding is going to be, how we're going to make sure that we're not only prepared for the budget for war, but for the budget for folks who are returning home. Because when we made the decisions to go to war, there was not a single debate about what we were going to do to protect the veterans and their families once they came home.
Thank you.
I think the best example of politicizing a war for gain surely came during Vietnam. And I can remember battles that were being won by our soldiers, but the news said, oh no, we're losing. Oh no, it isn't what you think. That had a lasting impact on me. And my take on it is, one, if we decide that we must intervene in another country in war, it is time for the generals, the admirals to fight the war and not Congress. And I can remember my dad raising his hand and saying, I'm going to go to Vietnam. This is early 1963, very early. And do you all remember when we actually officially entered Vietnam? It was much later. So politicizing these activities is pretty much akin to what I see with what has happened recently with Libya. We clearly had a case, and while this is not military, but a case where our consulate generals were without defense, were attacked. But the political response was to say, rather than say, wait a minute, I need to collect the facts, was to say, no, it's the fault of that movie over there. That is politicizing. And that really ticks me off, because every one of us knows that in these events, it really pays to take a minute and make sure you know what you're talking about.
Thank you.
I might just add that when we get distracted by politicizing, once we are engaged, that we lack the American solidarity, and it removes us from our commitment, and it really does have an impact on the safety and well-being. And in the case of the recent issues, which we are all distressed by in the Middle East and Libya, I think it's very important for this country to stay true to the men and women who are affected. And I worry that when we politicize any of these issues, that retreat from our national security interests and the lack of solidarity has created, I think, significant issues in this country that ought to be addressed by your elected officials.
Thank you. Janice, I tell you guys, it's sure a good thing that I write down who's next, because I would have forgotten. This next question will be directed towards Janice. Many have considered the Afghanistan war, because it has toiled for so many years, to be called the forgotten war, especially to the press, where now when we lose a service member, it is on the third or the fourth or the fifth page. But of course, it's a great issue to the family members, and since January 1st of 2012, we are losing an average of one service member per day to this war. How will you show our military that they are not forgotten here in New Mexico?
This is intensely personal. My son's best friend has done several tours in Afghanistan. And I think first the way to show them respect and show them that they are not forgotten is to acknowledge the really good work our servicemen and women have actually done in Afghanistan. And I know every single one of us are tired. We've been there a long time. And my heart says, come home, come home. But we have to remember why we were there. Our job, and the job of our young men and women, was to go and root out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. is now a nation struggling to be a nation strong enough to stand on its own. While we have been there, our servicemen and women have built schools. They have built roads. They have helped with farming. They have built libraries. It is remarkable to listen to the stories of my son's friend, his name is Ian Moss, about the irrigation systems that they actually built. And it was right. So if we walk right this minute, do we leave Afghanistan open to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda taking over the nation and overrunning a people who would like to be free? I know of no better way than to stay the course. We're not alone, by the way. At least 20 other nations are right there with us. And when our young people come home, listen to what they did, because it is absolutely remarkable.
Thank you.
We all want our service members to return home safely, and I know there isn't anyone anywhere in the world that wants war. And we are all grateful for the efforts today to bring our men and women home. The issue for me is what happens when they come home. As I identified in my opening remarks, we have significant issues that are yet to be addressed and insufficient funding. And in fact, we're looking at increasing Veterans Administration budget by $20 million, but that's stalled, and I have to tell you, it's being met with great resistance in Congress. And we have a huge shortfall, so let me give you a couple of examples. When you return home, we know that PTSD and traumatic injuries are significant and need to be addressed, and we are equipped. Here in Albuquerque, in the Veterans Hospital, the requirement is that they treat those individuals within, or at least screen them, within 14 days of a request to be seen. Often it's months. Now, in initial reports, the Veterans Administration reported to Congress that they were on track and that 90% of the folks they were seeing within those 14 days. In fact, it's far fewer than 50%, and it required an investigation to identify that there was inappropriate accountability about how that information is being provided. I will also tell you there are more than 1,500 individuals today with no answer being provided to Congress who are waiting for pain management evaluations today at the Veterans Center. If we're not going to invest to assure that you have access to those services and those healthcare benefits, after we ask you to protect our freedoms and serve this country and create democracies in other parts of the world to protect those individuals, we are really missing our comprehensive global investment in these families. In Albuquerque, the #1 growing homeless population are women veterans. Because with these issues, you can't succeed at a job, you don't succeed with your family, there aren't supports for the family and children, which is why we have 11% unemployment for this population, growing homelessness, and insufficient health care. It seems to me that where we really can make a difference is by making sure that those services and benefits are invested in, supported, and prioritized.
Thank you.
You know, it's easy to talk about this particular conflict in a vacuum as if we go over, we come back, we're done, we have PTSD. This war is different. We have young people who are on their 3rd, 4th, 7th tour. This particular era, our young people are in combat for as much as 1,000 days, whereas in Vietnam it was just slightly under 300 days. And while all of those services are important, the lesson we learned from Vietnam is that you must not underestimate or overlook the service provided. Probably more important than treatment for PTSD is really important. All of those things are important. But what every single one of you do in this room for these young people is listen to them, respect their service.
Thank you.
Again, as we have this debate, I mean, something that we so many families right here at home in Mexico.
Thank you. Michelle, this next question will be directed toward you. First, it won't be directed toward you.
Sorry.
American military values and used to equal strength across the world. In light of what's gone on recently in the last 2 weeks, I ask both of you, is it still so today?
I believe that our credibility and respect around the world is increasing. I am certainly, and I would guess, venture to guess that many people here today feel the same way, that it has been diminished in past years, and it has been a difficult and arduous journey to restore our position in the world, to restore our credibility in the world, and to create an environment where we're known as fighting for freedom and democracy, and that we take that responsibility seriously. And it's not only just in protecting the United States from real threats and terrorism, but it's also recognizing what happens when we don't protect human interests around the world and being available for humanitarian issues. I'm proud of the work that we have initiated, but I don't think by any stretch of the imagination we're quite there. And I don't have, and I want everyone here to know that I don't know anyone in Congress that doesn't take seriously that our military branches are significant, and that those budgets and investments make all the difference in making sure that that credibility and our opportunity to protect this nation and others is ultimately secure. But making sure that we do that in an effective, productive way, and also that we don't allow, based on some of those earlier questions, that those budgets get stalled in a way that hurts those active military personnel and their families back home, I think also has an issue with our credibility and about our inability sometimes to respond in the most efficacious manner. So I do. I think our credibility around the world is improving, and I'm proud of that, and I would be dedicated to making sure that our investments and decisions continue on that very productive path.
Thank you.
Does American military value equal strength today as it did in the past? Sort of. I can remember at the beginning of Desert Storm, Special Ops Group C deployed without bullets. I remember my father talking about being in an airplane, and thank goodness they had wire, so they were able to come back. I know stories from all of you where you had equipment that didn't work, and we all know the stories of our young men and women in Iraq working with the IEDs, and there were no plates on the bottom of the Humvees to protect their bodies. The really remarkable story of all that awfulness, is our young people rise to the occasion time and time again, and they have done so with and without resources. It is an amazing story. So, does our military retain its strength in the world? Well, there's something else that is part of it. And I have to tell you, I was so honored to be with John while he was at the Naval War College, where they're thinking about how do you make peace? And their thesis 20 years ago was the greatest threat to our nation was our debt. I am convinced that the greatest threat to our nation is our debt. And it really doesn't matter how remarkable our young people are until we get ourselves morally right, morally straight, and clean our house up and get the debt under control. Our young people will stand in harm's way because they think it's their duty. It is their duty. But will they succeed? I am really scared about that. More than I have ever been scared in my entire life. Strength of the military, I don't think there's a country in the world that does not respect our military. But they do not respect a nation that does not have the economic might that we used to have. But ladies and gentlemen, we can get it back. We
you're already prepping for the next question, and I thought I had these things hidden pretty well, but you guys are doing a heck of a job of making my job easy by leading into the next question, so thank you both. If sequestration occurs, $500 billion in defense cuts over a 10-year period will occur. How will that affect our national security? Janice?
It's not a pretty picture. First off, send me to Congress because we have got to deal with this. We've got to deal with it right away. If we don't deal with it, here are the things that I think will happen. Some good, some not so good. We will be required to pull back our forward bases. We will be required to sever members from the military. A very disastrous choice when your economy is stressed, and we already have so many people without a job. And then there are the hidden things. You know, how many of you have been in the military where you really needed a paperclip, but you know what, there just wasn't an authorization for one? It will go from top to bottom. The types of research that make us more agile, I believe, will be put on hold. The part of securing our nation, this probably is the most frightening part. I believe that how we defend our nation is changing dramatically. If you look at the kids who are in Iraq and Afghanistan, the tools they have will just knock your socks off. But the next level is defending our nation from space. There are other countries who are already moving in that direction. Will we have the redundant satellites to defend our nation? I see that as an early cut. I believe that sequestration, first off, let me just tell you, as a legislator, this makes me crazy. When you go in as a legislature and you say, oh my goodness, we need to make cuts, let's make them across the board. I call that, sorry Adam, the chicken caca way to legislate. Because that's the easy way. Not everything has the same value. It is hard work to do this. It's time that Congress do the job.
Several significant issues. The Budget Control Act, lack of having the budget, sequestration, all efforts to figure out what we're going to do to reduce federal spending, given that our spending is not in line with what our federal revenues are. I agree that sequestration is a huge problem for so many things, not just defense spending. What it would do to New Mexico's economy is significant. What it would do to Sandia Labs is significant. What it would do to Sandia Labs investments in some of the technology, research, and job opportunities here in Torrance County would be significant. What we need is a Congress who is willing to compromise and to talk about a meaningful budget, a plan that addresses over the long term our deficit, and the long term our debt, that has short-term benefits that will make a difference, that will put people back to work, that will secure defense, that will secure our efforts and investments in the military. But we haven't been able to do that. And in fact, even today, we've got a budget, the Ryan budget, that would cut significantly from Sandia Labs, and would cut significantly from Veterans Administration's programs, including those that would serve homeless veterans. Those dedicated resources are more important than ever. You heard in an earlier question a reference about the number of men and women we lose every day. We lose them here, we believe, to suicide because they don't have access to the services and jobs and supports that they need. Sequestration, I think, is a disaster. I would fight hard to have a reasonable budget, one that affects and supports New Mexicans, one that is balanced, and one that doesn't forget our obligation to active military personnel and veterans and their families.
Thank you.
Sequestration is one thing, certainly irritated. The Ryan budget is another. And I want to point out something about the Ryan plan. So when you are a member of the legislative body, you have to show up when your state is possibly threatened. Our delegation did not show up. The fact that our delegation failed to make the case for New Mexico a very specific case, because we do something no other state does in the Union for our national security, is why, in my opinion, it is not reflected in the Biden plan. Had I been in Congress, I promise you I would have been there, and I would not have left until they made sure that what was covered for Sandia, Los Alamos, and the military bases here were intact, because I know what it does to our national security.
That's a very valuable and important point. You've got to be willing to fight for who it is that you're representing. But I will assure you that in that budget there are several states, and I don't know whether our congressional delegation was engaged as directly as they should or shouldn't have been. But I will tell you that many others were, and they have the same chopping block issues that we would be facing here. They're global. It's not just what happens at Sandia. It happens at labs and research and Veterans Administration and hospitals all across the country. And so they were there to fight. This is not a budget that reflects very effectively the priorities that we need today to get people back to work, to make sure that veterans and their families are protected, and to make sure that our investments for national security, our active personnel, are maintained and appropriate. And so again, I would fight sequestration and would work hard for a reasonable budget that reflected New Mexico's values and needs first.
Thank you. Michelle, some say that with the budget cuts, the American veterans are facing the perfect storm. Yesterday's job report showed that 96,000 new jobs being created. 243,000 jobs need to be created each month just to keep the unemployment rate at a steady pace. The troop drawdown that we are looking at, 100,000 active service members, an additional 20,000 reservists coming home and facing the job market. In 3 years, that number is expected to reach 450,000 returning veterans. What can we do in Congress to assure that there is some type of job placement for our men and women fighting for this country?
Thank you. Well, I can think of two things immediately, and I'm going to put a number out there for you. And in that question, we're talking about 1 million veterans joining the ranks over that period of time. 1 million. Now, we just had an opportunity to pass a Veterans Jobs Bill in the Senate, and it had bipartisan support. Senator Heller and Senator Snow both working diligently to make sure that this bill got passed. Now, the debate on the bill wasn't about whether or not we should be investing in making sure that veterans have jobs when they come home. We have an 11% unemployment rate. But what was debated was the technicality about whether or not, under these budget constraints, you could appropriate more than the limit. And the debate became about that. Now, I'm really troubled by that, when we know that those investments not only do the right thing for the men and women who are depending on us, but they bring money back into the federal government in a way that begins to get that budget in a position that we can make thoughtful and meaningful decisions. Now, that job, much like FDR's work, to get people, to get Americans back to work in the Depression, would have created so many meaningful jobs. Because part of the problem is that we don't transition our veterans into a workplace that makes sense. We don't have, if you will, a boot camp that retrains you for the workforce. And so there's a disconnect about the kinds of skills and jobs that you have. Many of these young men and women went into the military as high school, right after they graduated high school. They only know their military training. They are ill-equipped to deal with that here. And the programs that the Department of Defense have, the Transition Assistance Program, really isn't providing those skills. There's a brand new program, I think in Colorado, might be Arizona, it's the Southwestern Conservation Corps that's training veterans to do first responder and firefighter work. It's having great success. That tells me that this Veterans Jobs Act, if we could invest, we could make New Mexico the first responder fire training academy the #1 place for veterans in the United United States. And that's the kind of effort that I would fight for right here at home.
I get a little frustrated with some of the posturing going on in Congress. I'm well aware of the bill that went through the Senate. It passed, however, Congress has gone home. So what are we going to do right now? And there are some real answers. Waiting for Congress to come back isn't good enough. But to think that our young people coming back need to have a boot camp, and let me tell you what our young people are learning and what they bring back. I'm not sure it's the young people. It may well be our businesses that need the help. These young kids have technological skills that you have not seen before. When they work on a vehicle, doesn't matter what kind of computer boards are in that vehicle, they are on top of it. Our military has some of the most superb training in the world. And that training, by the way, includes taking those kids out of high school who cannot read. And most programs have them reading within 7 weeks. I hope you're asking, how come our schools can't do that? They do this. Now here's the problem, is we need to find another way for employers and government to talk to these young kids. Something really exciting has happened in the city of Albuquerque. And you would think this is like one of those duh moments. So when our young returnees come back and they apply at the city of Albuquerque, they have an employment form that says, what job are you applying for? And at the bottom it says, if you're a veteran, what else do you know how to do? Turns out, from this form, very rarely are they being hired for the job that they're applying for, but they are looking at this cornucopia of cross-training and are hiring our young veterans. And then there's the other issue. So in the state of New Mexico, do we have opportunities? Yes. And the employers in the Guard are working on this very diligently right this minute. In southeastern New Mexico, we have an industry that needs truck drivers with CDLs. So what unit do we have over in Egypt right this minute? It is the transportation unit. Every single one of those people have a CDL. So what do we do to start matching the people who have that need with the young returning veterans? Guess what? It's not so hard. Waiting for Congress to do this, ladies and gentlemen, this is our job.
Thank you.
I don't think the bill passed. I believe that it was blocked in the Senate. As recent as Wednesday, my information would suggest that $1 billion that would have been appropriated got blocked because they couldn't reach a 60-vote majority on that technicality about whether or not they could spend above the limit for this particular priority, which we do in budget authorizations and reappropriations in Congress. But the things, if we couldn't do that, we couldn't have responded to Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. So I don't take lightly holding to a budget, but if you can't do that when you need it, it's a huge problem. And we should have done it here, and we should have put these men and women right back to work. And I'll tell you something else, that these certifications that you have in the military don't transfer here. So your truck driver certification, you have to get another one right here. And you have to meet those testing requirements and those training requirements. So you're disadvantaged and discriminated against even though you have the skill. You can't compete here. If you're an ambulance driver in Iraq or Afghanistan, you cannot be an ambulance driver here unless you meet the standards that we place and pose. And when you come back, we're not in a position to do that effectively. We need to do more to make sure that that discrimination, those unfair practices are eliminated and removed so that we can put these men and women who return home right back to work.
Thank you. Janice?
I have to disagree with my opponent. You know, our young people coming back with those military IDs, I assure you that they are allowed to drive. Their qualifications are superb. There is a time when eventually they will get that CDL in the state. They have a military credential, and everyone that I know
that question kind of hit dear to me because I was in Army intelligence, and when I got out, they said Army intelligence was an oxymoron, and hell, nobody hired me. They said it didn't exist. Start from square one. This was the number one asked question by members that came up to me from the VFW and the American Legion. When I talked to them, obviously jobs, we discussed that here already for the military. But how is the President's amnesty program for young illegal immigrants going to help those who serve the country competing to fill those limited jobs? Janice?
If you're talking about, well, actually, any of the things that, well, under the DREAM Act, you could argue that there are young illegals who will go to the head of the line versus our veterans. I'm not necessarily sure that that is the case, but if it is the case, then I'm sorry. Head of the line privileges go to our military.
Thank you, Michelle.
I'm not sure I agree with the characterization. I'm not sure it's about the DREAM Act, because the DREAM Act is legislation that proposes to make sure that young people who were brought to this country know no other country. They didn't make those decisions on their own, that they have the opportunity to be citizens and to participate as any citizen would in this country. And something that in this debate that I think is good legislation and I think is the right thing to do. The President's executive order, I don't view as amnesty. The executive order is looking at what we do about work permits and making sure that there is a process for folks who are here undocumented to be able to apply. Part of that effort is we don't have immigration reform in this country. We're not sure what to do with it. 11 million, 12 million, 14 million undocumented families here. And the notion that we could deport those individuals, we can't. We don't even have a system, even if I thought that was right, and I don't. We don't have a system to do that effectively, to break apart those families. So I think that this is an effective start, and I think that the President is working diligently to spur the conversation to make sure that Congress acts on national immigration policy that's meaningful and fair, and make sure that anybody, if we get to immigration policy, you're back of the line, pay your fines, and we're clear about illegal and nefarious activity in our efforts to get that accomplished.
Thank you.
Question, but I think the question really gets down to, does a veteran have a right to be first over somebody who is here who is undocumented? And I think there are many ways to actually get there, but I think the answer has to be yes.
We want folks, these are workers' permits. These are not the kind of employment investments that the Senate could have passed. These are not the efforts like the Southwest Conservation Board that's working diligently to hire veterans. As a recent, I just resigned my commission as a Bernalillo County Commissioner. We're very clear about two things: veterans hiring preferences and disability hiring preferences. And often that is a two-part benefit to a applying veteran or their family members. We have to keep all of those investments in the GI Bill, every other benefit that's meaningful. The notion that in the immigration aspect that we would put veterans in a competitive fashion is not what we're talking about at all. And I certainly don't want anyone, based on my answer, to get that impression. But I see them as very different issues, recognizing that we have had many chances in this country to invest in jobs and to invest in veterans. And I will do everything I can in the same way I have over the last 20 years of my career to make sure that we're investing in those programs and in those services for veterans and their families. And employment's got to be a priority.
Thank you. I want to maybe rephrase the question because I think that it was missed being a moderator, I have the right to do that. I can appreciate both comments on employment. My concern, though, is what I'm hearing is veteran preference for government employment, which we're only addressed, which the federal government does, which almost every form of government. I appreciate different types of programs for veterans, but what they're coming up to me and saying, if I have no job and I go to